everybody, and welcome, and thank you so much for coming here on a Friday evening. I'm delighted to introduce our author today, and the topic today is of personal interest. By way of introduction, my name is Nashua. I am a local Hong Kong poet, sometimes moderator, and several other hats, but for the purposes of today, we're here to have a conversation about the magic of storytelling and how that could be brought to life in lots of different ways and enabled by technology. So I'm aware that this is still a very new sort of area, particularly for Hong Kong, and so it's really exciting that we're all here to hear about it and hear about ways that we could all get involved. So, Emma, I'm going to read your bio first. So, Emma is a professional audiobook narrator and also co-wrote and hosted the Alfie and Hugo Award-winning podcast Tea and Jeopardy. So you're a podcaster as well. She writes short stories, novels, and novellas in multiple speculative fiction genres. She won the British Fantasy Society Best Short Story Award 2015 for A Woman's Place in the 221 Baker Street's anthology. Between Two Thorns is the first book in Emma's Split World Urban Fantasy series, was shortlisted for the BFS Best Novel and Best Newcomer 2014 awards, and a science fiction novel, After Atlas, was shortlisted for the 2017 Arthur C. Clarke Award, and the third novel in the Planetfall series, Before Mars, has been shortlisted for a BSFA Best Novel Award. Wow. Incredibly impressive. So delighted to have you here today, and welcome, Emma.
Thank you, and thank you to everyone for coming. So yes, I'm going to focus on my job as an audiobook narrator today, rather than my job as an author. And as has been kindly introduced, I have written many novels. I've had 10 novels published, but I've narrated, I haven't actually counted them all, but I estimate over 30 audiobooks in lots of different genres. Some of those books, a small number of those books are my own, and some are crime fiction. I have narrated a lot of crime fiction, some thrillers, some romance, and some historical romance novels as well, and fantasy romance very recently, which was actually a lot of fun. And one of the things that people want to know when they find out that I'm an audiobook narrator is, how do you get that job? It's quite an unusual job to have. And like most things involving my career, it was actually by accident. I had no intention of becoming an audiobook narrator. I'd finished my first novel, and I was desperate to get published. And this was back in 2010. And I was sending my book sample out with my query letter and getting rejection letter after rejection letter after rejection letter. And I'm quite scientifically minded, and it was driving me a little bit insane that I didn't know why it was being rejected. So I decided that I needed some feedback on this book. I didn't want to publish it online because that would be giving up some of the publishing rights. And so I decided that I would just record myself reading it and publish a chapter in audio form every week for people to feed back on. And when I look back at that, I think, my goodness, I would never do that now. The internet is terrifying, but, you know, I was a sweet summer child, and I did that. It was a nicer place as well. The internet was nicer.
How long ago was this?
This is like 2010, and it was before really horrible things happened on the internet. Yeah. So it was a golden age of people being polite and being nice in comments and having genuine conversations. And what was interesting was that when people started to give me feedback, they were enjoying the story, but they were also saying they were enjoying my narration. And all of my life, I had hated my voice. And so this was really bizarre, and I was quite shocked. But enough people started to say it that I thought, okay, maybe I should give this a go. I needed the money. I had an awful job, and I wanted to get out of it. And so I decided to audition for an audiobook for a Canadian audiobook company. that did online auditions, and the narrators recorded in their own home, and also did all of the editing. Again, when I look back at that, I think, my goodness, I would never do that now. But I was starting out, and I sent in an audition, and I got it. And I was amazed. And then I had to learn how to be an audiobook narrator, because suddenly I had this job to do. And it was a very, very steep learning curve. I have lots of people who say, oh, I read to my child every night. I love reading to my child. So I would like to be an audiobook narrator. And I go, oh, honey, it's not like that at all. When I did that first book, recording from home, I could read for about half an hour at a time before I would have to have a break. Now, when I go into the studio, I record for 7 to 8 hours a day. And each session is somewhere between an hour to an hour and 15 minutes long. And then there's a short break, and then back in for another hour, short break, back in for another hour. So the stamina that you need is quite incredible. But back then I would do it in half an hour chunks. And then I started to build a portfolio. And I was making friends with other writers online, and one of them asked me to narrate a story for them, which I did. And then I actually had a book deal come in for another book that I'd written, which was the first of the Split World series. And by that point, I had narrated about 6 audiobooks for this online company, and I had a portfolio of other stories I had read. And when it was going to be made into an audiobook, I said, oh, please, 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 can I narrate it? Because I didn't want someone to get it wrong. I had very firm ideas about how people spoke, how names were pronounced, lots of very complicated names. And the audiobook company said, okay, audition. And so I auditioned for my own book. And I was very nervous. And I just did not sleep for 2 nights thinking, am I going to be able to narrate my own book? And luckily, they said yes. And through that, I met a local audiobook production company who were 20 minutes down the road. And they were just starting out in audiobooks. I think they'd produced 2 audiobooks. This was in 2012. And they got this gig because I lived locally, and the audiobook company was based in America.
Right.
And I was obviously not going to fly to America to record an audiobook. So they found this local company and paired us up. And we've been working together ever since. And what's wonderful is that because of the Split Worlds deal, which eventually was 5 books, and because of other work that I brought in because of knowing other authors, it became a much bigger company. They have several members of staff now. They have their own premises. They were renting a studio from another company before. So it's kind of like a local business success story as well, which is wonderful. And I still work with them, and we're very good friends.
That's brilliant.
So it's a lot of luck as well.
So can I point out 2 things? The first one is around, so this started 2010, 2012. And could you talk a bit about the technologies and how they've sort of evolved? Because today we think of Audible, or we think of podcasts, or sort of Apple Podcasts, or so many Stitcher, so many platforms out there that sort of podcast or internet radio or even audiobooks. What was around in 2010? What was the main way, and who were the people listening back then?
It was just starting to take off back then, and certainly all of the books that I've recorded of my own work are produced in the CD format.
Right.
Where you have like
What are those?
14 CDs and these huge, great big things. And they look funny to me now because in the meantime, everything has started to become streaming, and Audible it was established, but it wasn't as powerful as it is now. And so the studio that I work with, all of the studios I've worked with, we record producing incredibly high quality sound. And when you have an audiobook that's produced on CD, you have 2 different formats. You have a very, very good voice format, and then you have an MP3 on CD format, which just annoys me, because the MP3 format compresses the data. And to my ear and to everybody involved in audiobooks, it sounds tinny and flat. Whereas if you hear the studio recording, it's very warm and has a lot of depth. So yeah, back then there was slightly more emphasis on CDs, and CDs are used in the library network still, because a lot of library users, especially those who are older, don't necessarily have MP3 players and they don't stream their audiobooks.
Yes.
So that technology is still there alongside. But in the intervening years, it's all gone to online streaming services. And the other thing that's been interesting about Audible's model is that they have a credit model. And so people subscribe and they get a certain number of credits to spend every month. And that can affect which audiobooks people buy because of the length of the audiobook. And so the culture of consumption of audiobooks has actually changed quite a lot just in the time that I've been narrating.
I think it's also, so you get a free credit a month, and it's almost like that is currency, and the laws of scarcity come into it, because then you've got to spend your pocket money, as it were, very, very carefully. So it becomes this whole sort of intellectual debate of, well, do I want to spend it on fiction or non-fiction? And if so, would I rather read that, or would I? So there are all these, I guess, very personal decisions that come about. But one thing I wanted to sort of emphasize, the second thing I was going to say was, it's quite rare for an author to narrate their own book, isn't it? And for me, that is a huge selling point. I thought it was really cool that you narrate your own stories.
It's very useful. There are a few that do it. I heard the reason why I was asked to audition is because they had several authors insisting on reading their own.
Right.
But they were terrible. And that's why they brought in this policy of auditioning first. And it's true that you do have some authors who do both. Mary Robinette Kowal is a wonderful example of an excellent author and also a professional audiobook narrator. And it really helps. I am not scared of doing public readings in the way that I would have been if I wasn't a narrator, because I know I get nervous for different reasons. I get nervous being in front of people when I'm recording an audiobook in the studio. It's just me and the sound engineer and sometimes a director, sometimes they're one person. And so there's no audience. There is performance anxiety, but it's a different kind of performance anxiety. So yeah, it's very useful. There are a few of us, but you're right, not the majority. And sometimes, I'm going to sound terrible, but when I'm at conventions, I go to a lot of conventions all over the world, and there are usually readings as program items, and so I will share an hour's slot with other authors. And sometimes they read their work so badly that I have to stop myself from saying, no, stop. I can hear this is a really good story and you're murdering it. Please, can I read it for you? And that would be awful. And I'm a terrible person. And I feel terrible for thinking that. But it's a skill that is very important when you're an author, because you don't want to make your own work sound terrible. And
for sure.
Yeah, and it's funny, I have various author friends as well who have got really good at reading because of the fact that they're an author and they have to go and do public events. And one of them literally emailed me last week saying, can I be really cheeky and ask you how you do this professionally? Because I think I'm ready to do this now. And so I've got this sideline and being taken out for dinner by author friends who want to know how to do this. So I think it's becoming more popular because certainly in the UK, audiobooks have become so popular just in the last year or two. A really wide range of people are now adopting it because they like to listen on commutes, they like to listen when they're doing the washing up, and people are realizing, like you were saying before we started, there's not enough time to read all the books you want to sit down and read, but listening when you're doing something else, people are really starting to get on board with. So it's a big industry over there now.
For me personally, it has been one of the only ways I can convince myself to go to the gym, because otherwise it just feels like a waste of time. But if I'm going and there's going to be a learning process as part of it, well, that's a value exchange I can get behind. So you're absolutely right in terms of you've seen it on the listener side, the data coming through in terms of how this is not really a new trend, but one that we're seeing globally kind of take off at the same time.
Yes.
What's really wonderful about it from somebody who's relatively new to it is I didn't realize the level of craft that has gone into it. So exactly what you're saying about it is a skill set, because you think, oh, someone's just going to read you a book. But it's storytelling, and in its most purest form. And when you think of us, hearkening back to our long primal memories of being around a fire and, being cave people and just talking to each other, communicating with each other in story form, it is one of the most comforting ways to experience content.
It's an interesting thing as well, because my approach to it as a narrator has changed over the years. When I first started out, I was very conscious of not getting in the way, because you start to have a three-person relationship. When you're a reader reading a book, the relationship is between you and the author. And as the reader, it's all in your head. Depending on what kind of reader you are, you may hear different voices and match it with the characterization in the novel, but it is all controlled by you as the reader. When you go into audiobooks, suddenly there is this third party who is the narrator. And in the beginning, I didn't want to kind of interpose too much. And I used to read quite neutrally in the prose. And obviously, I would add in some drama and blah, blah, blah. And I put most of my effort into the dialogue and into the acting. But now my attitude towards it has changed, because I feel that with the third person in the relationship, that third person has to bring value. That person has to bring the story to life actively. And I'm going to be reading some examples of how different types of scenes in books require a different kind of energy from the performance. So yeah, it's an intimate thing as well. If you start an audiobook and you really don't like that person's voice, that kills it. And there's nothing you can do about that. And there have been books that I've wanted to listen to, and I just could not stand the accent or the actual voice itself, and I've had to stop, and I felt very bad. But it's one of those, it's a very personal thing. And I've had people get in touch with me saying, I love your voice, and I really enjoy listening to you, but you're so comforting, I fall asleep and I don't know what happens. And I wake up the next day and go, but I don't remember the end of that chat. Oh no, it happened again. And I'm like, I'm sorry? So I have people who then go and buy the books to read them to find out what happens.
Oh, that's hilarious.
But listen to go to sleep. And I don't know whether to be flattered or upset. I don't know. It's a strange world.
I go with flattered, I think.
Yeah.
Bought the story twice for two very different reasons.
Shall I talk you through the process of production?
Brilliant. That was just my next question, actually.
Cool.
So we were at 2010, 2012, and now we're at 2019, and you've been working with this production company, and presumably they've grown, and your sort of range and your skill set has developed in that time. Mm-hmm. What does it take to get to where you are? Who needs to be in the room? What's the process?
So in the studio that I do most of my work with, I do work in other places, but the one that I spend the most time with, they have a small office in a small kind of office block area. It all looks very normal. And when you go in, there's an extra kind of mini room, which is the recording booth. And it has this foam, which has got a strange kind of texture. We call it egg box foam, which absorbs the sound waves. So when you're recording an audiobook, what you want is what we call a very dead space in terms of there being no echo, and to make it sound as warm and as rich as possible. If you record in a big room with nothing in it, there's almost like an echo, and it changes the quality of the voice. So it's a small room, there's a very small table, And it's got a double wall system. So there's the booth that I'm inside, which has got the foam on the inside. And then there's a gap, and then there's another wall to try and make sure that none of the noise from outside comes through. And sometimes it does, and we have to stop recording, and then we shout at helicopters and big planes, which have got very, very low frequency noises that can still get through, but most noise is stopped. There's a window on the left-hand side in the booth I spend the most time in, and through that I can see the sound engineer and also the director. Sometimes the director does the sound engineering, it depends on the project. And so I can see the screen, I can see my voice waves appearing as I'm narrating, but I don't look at that when I'm narrating, I look at the page in front of me. I always read off an iPad, and the reason for that is because when I'm preparing a book, I can annotate an electronic PDF, and it's really easy to work with. And then when we do the last stage, which we call pickups, which is where we record anything that needs to be re-recorded, any errors, we mark up a manuscript. The proof listener marks up the errors, and then we can just go straight to them, the different annotations in the document. So it's a really smooth process. I have giant headphones, which are ridiculous, and a really, really nice mic, and what we call a pop shield, which is basically just a bit of mesh, which takes the energy, it absorbs the energy from what we call plosives. So the that there's no shield on this. There's the integral shield on this microphone, but that pop sound you don't want in an audiobook, because if you listen to thousands of words that begin with P and you have this noise on it, it'd be awful. So we have a pop shield. And then as I record, the headphones that I'm wearing play my own voice to me in real time as I'm reading. So it's like my brain splits into two, and one half of my brain is working on the performance and reading a line ahead. So that part is thinking about the delivery of the line. So if it's a very emotional scene, it will be how I'm portraying the emotion of that dialogue. Or if it's an accent, it'll be working very hard on representing that, portraying it accurately, on pronouncing things properly, on enunciation, and reading ahead, because you always need to be able to read slightly ahead to get the intonation correct. Because certainly in English, they put the question mark at the end. Spanish is great because you have the question mark at the beginning of the sentence, so you know it's a question. But in English, you get to the end, it's like, oh, that was a question. So you always have to read a little bit ahead to get the intonation correct. The other half of my brain is listening to what I've just done and deciding if it was good enough, and if I've done that correctly, if my voice is starting to sound a little bit off, if I need to pace that differently, if I've conveyed the correct interpretation. Some lines, especially of dialogue, you can change the meaning with the way that you say it. Yeah. And sometimes the director will stop and say, well, actually, I think that actually needs to have more of this emotion in it. And sometimes we'll have a debate about how best to interpret what is being said in a scene. And sometimes, so let's say there's a car chase, and I feel like I'm really, going at it and doing the correct pace. I may be stopped, and he may say, "No, can you do that again, but with more drama?" And I'll be thinking, "Oh, I just want a cup of tea, and that felt really dramatic to me." And so you do it again, and making sure the energy is correct. So in terms of the studio, there is always one other person. There are sometimes two other people. I'm very lucky that my director makes the best cups of tea in England. And this is very important. Because
it's a very tall claim.
Very, very, very. And I do not say this lightly, because I am very fussy. And he is a star. So we work together very closely in terms of preparing the manuscript as well. He will communicate with the author and ask questions about pronunciation of names and place names. One of the interesting things about preparing crime books is that you will always have the killer revealed at the end. When you do this in an audiobook, you have to make sure that the voices of all of the suspects don't give away who the killer is until the end.
That's fascinating.
And
I never thought of that.
Yeah, we have really long debates with some books where it's like, this is going to be obvious because they're the only person who has this kind of voice. And so sometimes we have to, if there are scenes where you have the killer with their latest victim and they're doing terrible things or about to do terrible things to them, I will act with their voice like in a whisper or quite hoarse because they're excited, as a way to plausibly disguise who the killer actually is. But there have been a couple of books where we've had to get in touch with the author and say, there is no way that we can hide this. Can we change the text? Because it says that they have a very, very broad Scottish accent, and they're the only Scottish character in the book. And I will be cheating, and the audience will know immediately who it is. So sometimes we have to actually change it for the audio version. That's very rare. So those are the people who are involved in the actual recording process. And then you have a sound engineer, an editor who will go through when I make a mistake. We used to do it that we would stop the recording, go back to the beginning of the sentence where the mistake was, and then re-record. Nowadays, we don't tend to do that. I will just pause with 1 or 2 seconds of silence and then start the sentence again without any kind of what we used to call punch-in recording. So after the sessions have been recorded, the editor goes through, makes sure that all of the sound levels are even between the chapters and different recording days, and also takes out all of the errors. Sometimes, if it's just before lunch, my stomach will rumble. Oh, no. And we have to take out stomach rumbles and tractors that we didn't hear until too late. And so they do that. Then it's sent to a proof listener. So it's like a proof reader, but for listening. And they sit with the manuscript and they read as they listen, and then they will mark up any errors. And then the last part of the process for me is to go back to the studio and to do what we call the pickups, where we record the errors correctly, and then they're edited in, and then all of the technical upload side of things happens. So it's quite a long and involved process, and there's usually anywhere between 3 to 4 to 6 or 7 people involved in the production.
And how long does it take end to end? I know it depends on, say, a 300-page novel.
Yeah, so it also depends on the novel, interestingly enough, because if it's a very fast-paced thriller or fast-paced, you do read it slightly faster overall. Generally, a 300-page book would be about 3 to 3.5 days in the studio. And it also depends on your narrator. So I'm very experienced now, and I'm what they call a clean narrator. It's nothing to do with whether I have a shower before I go. It's to do with how many errors I make when I record. So when I record an audiobook, usually out of every hour of recording in the booth, we will get about 50 to 55 minutes of finished audio, because I make very few errors. Whereas when I started out, we would get hopefully somewhere around 40 to 45 minutes from an hour in the booth. So that's what we call a finished hour, is the final audio that you get. So if you have a narrator, we've had a few times where a narrator has been chosen because they have a very particular accent. There have been some American books that have come into the studio. But the person who has the perfect voice and the perfect accent may not have a lot of experience. So they will take longer in the studio, and they have to build that into their schedule. If I'm reading one of my own books, I can do it in even less time because I know the manuscript so well. We don't have to pause for any kind of discussion. Occasionally I will receive direction, but very rarely, because I know what it's supposed to go like. I wrote it. So those books go very quickly. So usually a 300-page book would result in anywhere between 10 to 11, sometimes 12, depending on the book, finished hours of audio at the end. So it's a lot of time that goes into the production of something, but it does end up with quite a long product at the end.
Yep.
I recorded a book which was 177,000 words long. I'm really glad it was an amazingly good book, because that would have been miserable if it had been a book I didn't like. But it's a book I love, and I'm actually going to read you an excerpt. And that took 5.5 days. And the finished audio was just over 21 hours long. So that's good value on Audible when you have a credit, because you get a lot of it.
Another factor that comes into the decision-making process.
Yeah, it does. It does.
Actually, can we talk a little bit about Audible? Because I find the psychology around that really, really interesting. Is Audible the place to get audiobooks, or are there other players, and are they structured differently, or is it all based on a credit system?
It's quite a controversial topic, because Audible have been very aggressive in their in grabbing the market share, and it follows a very similar pattern to Amazon, and Audible is an Amazon company. So yeah, they are dominant in the marketplace, but there are other places where you can get audiobooks. The library system in the US is different to the library system in the UK, but they both have an audiobook branch now.
Right.
So you can get audiobooks from your library. And there are other services. There's a new company that's come along that I've just started to work with called Findaway Voices. And they are also a distributor, but they distribute in multiple places. So it's a really interesting marketplace at the moment, because when we started out, there weren't that many places where you could get audiobooks, but there were several. And then Audible ate them all. It either bought them or drove them out of business. And now we're seeing the response to that, where we're seeing other companies saying, well, we can offer something slightly different. So it's an interesting time. And I haven't actually checked because I was over here, but I saw somebody talking about a new service that's come out where it captions books and where it reads out books electronically and saying, is this the death of narration? And it's like, really? You know, we had people saying that ebooks are the death of books, and they weren't. So it's a marketplace which is changing a lot, that is growing a lot. But I would say that Audible has the biggest share, and it has the best penetration in the market, certainly in the UK and the US. And certainly as an author, if the Audible release is delayed, I will have people saying, when's it out on Audible? When's it out on Audible? Because once they get into the Audible system with the credits, they don't want to buy books anywhere else. So.
That's true. Very clever of Audible.
Oh yes, yes.
But it's that thing as well. You know, at that point on, I don't really believe that diversification leads to cannibalism. I think if you offer people more ways to consume good content, it actually enlarges the market, because people will ultimately try different things out and then find their preference. For me, it happens to be my gym time is my audiobook time, because I have the unfortunate habit of falling asleep if it's my commute, because I just find narration so comforting. But there's also, it's interesting because the trend with audiobooks and automation and AI, they haven't actually converged at the same time. So we've always had services like that can transcribe, and it's always been seen as a service. So an AI or a robotic voice would read something off a page, and that's been used in translation, that's been used for very sort of practical reasons. But one of the elements that have sort of really helped with this whole trend has been voice assistants. So Amazon Echo, which one's the Echo? So Echo, Siri, and Alexa. And I guess people are getting used to interacting with a device and hearing a response. And as we move into smart homes and 5G and all of that, it's actually really exciting for, I think, the audiobook space, because it's becoming, I hope, that as normal as it is for us to sit in our front room and to watch something on Netflix, that we'd be able to sit down with a cup of tea and just listen to something like we used to on the radio. Yeah,
I agree with that. And one of the things that I'm very excited about with the development of home devices like Echo Dot and Amazon Alexa. I hope I've got that the right way around.
I know, it's very concerning.
One of the things I'm very excited about is the development of choose your own audiobooks, where you can interact with a choose your own adventure story through voice.
That's amazing.
Which makes me very excited because I'm a role player as well, and that is close to that as I've heard things getting. In terms of whether I think narrators will ultimately be replaced by technology, I wouldn't be surprised if in 10 years' time they have voices that can read things as well as a person. At the moment, they're the automatic voice readers. My director uses them because he has very bad problems with his eyes, and if he reads text for a long time, he gets terrible, terrible migraines. And so when he's preparing a manuscript, he has the electronic voice read the manuscript, and I've heard it sometimes, and it is the most bizarre experience because there's no intonation, there's no acting.
It's very flat,
It's
isn't it?
very, very flat, and sometimes it's even hard to understand what's happening because you don't have the normal cues from intonation to indicate that that is a question or indicate that there is some suspense or that something frightening is happening. He then cut her throat with the knife. Oh, please don't do that. It's like a really bizarre experience. And listening to that, I think, oh, I'm fine. I'm going to have a job for a long time. But I think it is going to get better. And I have this debate in my mind of whether they will ever be able to reproduce the warmth and the empathy and the sense of drama that a human narrator can bring. But who knows? You know, we live in very strange times.
I would say, or my personal belief there is, yes, we can get technology to replicate, but we can't get it to evolve creatively in the same way that humans do. So how would an Alexa say supercalifragilisticexpialidocious when, you know, she's reading it off of text?
There are some interesting things that have been done in AI where they have seen genuine creativity from artificial intelligence and from some machine intelligence systems where they give...
Okay, that's terrifying.
Yeah, it is. Where they will give an AI a task to complete, like, I don't know, complete this circuit, and it will give it a set of components. And the AI uses the components in a completely bizarre way to achieve a goal. And I was researching this for my latest book, actually. And I was scared when I read it and thought, that's great, that's so exciting. Oh my God, that's really scary. Oh, it's so exciting. I couldn't decide. So I think that it is possible that it may well become sophisticated enough to be able to mimic well. Effectively, we are all just computers. You know, I am just applying many, many, many different algorithms when I am reading a text as a narrator. You know, I have been programmed by my language and the society in which I live the way to ask a question. Like,
sure.
So that process that my brain has done organically and naturally, I think, and in time, will be able to be reproduced by an AI because it's simply the replication of many, many, many rules that we've learned. It's just how sophisticated the system will need to be able to do that. It's still very difficult for artificial intelligence to be able to accurately read visual images. They can reproduce visual images, but not necessarily talk about them in a way that a person could. So there are really interesting gaps, and I don't know whether narration and performance would fall down one of those gaps. I hope so.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I won't have a job I really enjoy. Shall I tell you about some of the ways that we prepare a manuscript?
Yes.
So when you're a narrator and a book comes into the studio, they will put out a call for auditions because the publisher won't necessarily know. Sometimes they will say, we want Emma Newman to narrate this book, and I'll go, yay, and I don't have to audition. Sometimes the author will say that. But when especially if it's a new crime series or any other kind of genre, if it's a new series, we audition. There are lots of different narrators that work with the studio. And so if you get the job, you get the audiobook manuscript hopefully about a month before, sometimes a week before. And there's a process that I go through preparing the manuscript, which is really, really important. So the first thing is reading the whole book through. And that sounds obvious, but one of the very first audiobooks that my director produced with the studio was with a very, very, very famous actor, and I will not name them because it's a very embarrassing story. He went into the studio, sat down, started narrating, and he's an amazing actor and is a real professional and was doing it brilliantly. And Aaron, who's the director, hadn't had time to prepare the manuscript and thought, well, it's this guy, it's going to be fine. They were on day 3 of the recording, and it turns out that the main character had a very, very strong accent, what we call a Scouse accent. And it's a really, really recognizable, very, very, very thick accent, what we call a thick accent. And there was this awful silence in the studio as he read out this line that this character came from Liverpool and had a broad Scouse accent. And everything just stopped, and the sound engineer just stopped the recording. And this actor just cleared his throat and said, I can't speak with that accent anyway. Let's just ignore that. And just carried on. And Aaron was dying and going, no, this is awful, and I'm going to get so much hassle from the publisher. But the publishers were like, we don't want to say to him, you have to go back in there and do these other 3 days. And they just about got away with it because this actor was very, very famous. If I did that, I would not get away with that. I would have to go on my own time and re-record the whole book. So this is why you read the whole book through. I did a crime novel about 6 months ago, and on page 276 out of 302, it mentioned that the killer had a very, very strong Scottish accent when they were angry.
Oh dear.
And so I had to, even though I had been preparing the manuscript, I had to go back again to all the chapters where the killer was in those chapters, find where he was angry, so that I could then change the accent for those lines. And I was so glad that I had read the whole book before I went into the studio. So that is really, really important. So when I do a read-through, I have a notebook for all of my audio work. And I have a chapter breakdown of all the characters that appear in a chapter. And I have a cast list. And in the cast list, there's obviously the name of the character, but I will put any details, no matter how strange they are, about the character that the author puts in the text. Sometimes it's that they are very, very thin, or they have mean eyes, or they have very, very grey curly hair. Sometimes it's not even a description that's relating to voice, but it helps me to visualize the character so that I can then act that character. I'm always looking for accents as well, because if there is a character who has a particular accent, I might need to learn how to do that. And that has happened quite a few times. I had an audiobook which was a romance, and the lead character was American. The romantic hero was an American, even though it was a book set in England, English, characters. It wasn't an American book. So this was quite a shock to me. And the author said, I want his accent to be exactly the same as Matthew McConaughey's real American accent. So I said to Aaron in the email, that's very specific. And so I managed to find an interview with him. So if you want to go into voice acting and audiobook narration, a top tip is to find an actor who has exactly the same accent and to search for SAG-AFTRA, it's Screen Actors Guild. And they do these hour-long in-depth interviews with famous actors. And thank goodness they had done an interview with Matthew McConaughey. And so in the 2 weeks before this audiobook, I watched this interview about 50 times, learning his accent. And I got a bit of a crush on him, and I didn't like him before. But I found myself, he's a really charming guy, and I really liked him. And one of the things that I look for when I'm learning a new accent are what I call the hooks. There are usually 3 or 4 sounds in an accent that makes it sound like that accent as opposed to another. So for Matthew McConaughey's, I was looking for those hooks, started to get a feel for them, and then the next thing I do is I try to find a phrase that contains as many of those hooks as possible. So in this interview, at one point he says, "I was a real sturdy bug." And I was like, wow, that is really interesting because that contains most of the hooks of his accent. So he's saying, I was a real study bug, which sounds completely different in my normal accent. But when he says it, so the I sound goes from I to I was a real sturdy bug. And when you start to practice it, you feel you saying the words in a different part of your mouth. So when I say study bug, it's kind of in the middle of my mouth. But when he says it, it's right at the front of the mouth.
What is a study bug?
Somebody who reads a lot and studies a lot. He's a very clever guy.
I had to ask.
Yeah, he's a really, really clever guy and was very, very bookish. And so that's what I call my programmable phrase. So for every accent I have to learn, I find that phrase. So there was another book which was a crime series, and one of the policemen in the book comes from Northern Ireland, which has a very, very distinct accent.
Yes.
And that was quite a challenge to learn. And the programmable phrase in that one was, I've got to go from Matthew McConaughey to Northern Ireland now. Come on, brain. Down and then up again. It's a different kind of accent and a different kind of intonation. That's very bad because I haven't said that accent for about 2 years now. But down, and then up again, down and then up again. So down has that inflection that sounds very, very Northern Irish. And these programmable phrases are critical for me in the booth because when I'm looking at my notebook, which I have alongside the iPad, if there is an accent, a special accent in that scene, I will put an asterisk next to that chapter. And then I will look at what the character is and go, oh, okay, that's my Northern Irish character. And when we have like a 30-second break between each chapter where I'll have a sip of water and they end the file and they might, what we call, bounce it out to the editor. I will say that programmable phrase to myself several times to get my brain ready to then do that accent. But in the preparation stage, those lines of dialogue I will practice and practice and practice. And if it's an accent that I find very, very difficult, I find Scottish very difficult. I don't know why. Sometimes I have to find people to record those lines of dialogue for me if they have that accent, so that I can just mimic them as best I can.
So I have to ask, what is your favorite accent?
I really like the Northern Irish accent when I've practiced it a lot more.
I thought that was good, actually. You took me. There's a series on Netflix called Dairy Girls, and it was like, you sound exactly like the main character.
I really wish that had been out when I did those books because it would have been so useful. It would have been so useful. There are certain accents which I can just do without thinking about it, and those are my favorites because I don't have to worry. So my brain has to take a moment to switch. So my father's family come from the northwest of England, a place called Manchester, which has a very distinct accent. So whenever I have a character who's from the northwest, I think of my grandmother. And she'll say things like, let's have a brew. You're right, love. Let's have a brew and have a talk about it. What are you doing? It's a very, very kind of bright accent. I was born in Cornwall in the far southwest. So I can bring on a Cornish accent really easily because I heard it all the time I was growing up. And it sounds a bit strange. Apparently, I have a bit of a Cornish accent when I get drunk. Just comes out. I don't know. And so those are very easy. Yeah. And I do like a little bit of Cockney. And I do like it when it's a really awful woman who has a Cockney accent. It's really harsh. And it's a very, very kind of abrasive accent, and I think that came from watching EastEnders when I was a kid, because I cannot think of any other way I absorbed that accent other than it being on the TV every night. So those three accents are really useful, and in a lot of, especially British crime novels, and just generally in British fiction, there's a lot said about a character's background and socioeconomic class and status in society from the way that they talk. And so it's a really easy way to convey a stereotype, and I feel bad in kind of using stereotypes, but in audio, people want to have a very quick idea of whether somebody is dreadfully posh and perhaps has an awful lot of money. It does actually create quite a different impression that one has of a person, because they're talking very differently, and one can make assumptions about their education, about the amount of money they have in their bank account, perhaps whether they're an awful person or not. And those kinds of differences in accent. I use that accent for a lot of villains in my books. Really awful people are really posh and like, what am I saying?
Every James Bond film had that.
And the other thing as well in preparing an audiobook, especially if there is a female protagonist, is that we usually agree that her voice is my neutral voice, which is the voice I'm talking with now. So that it's the least amount of strain on the voice during an entire book where that character is talking the most. And I haven't had any kind of books where the protagonist has had a very strong accent. I love the Scouse accent. I'd love to have the opportunity to do it. I did an audition which had the phrase, the huff and puff of the grinding Calliope. And it's such a great accent.
Fun,
It's just really fun. And I was so upset when I didn't get it because I was dying to really get into that accent and I didn't get it.
How about, how do you convey age? So when it's a child versus somebody very old?
Yeah, so there are two ways that you convey information about anything to do with a character, not just age. In good writing, so a child will speak with different kinds of uses of grammar. So when you have a really good writer, it's a joy to read very young or very old characters because they will genuinely talk differently. With an older voice, I tend to slow it down a little bit and maybe add a little bit of a croak, just a little bit at the end. If it's an old lady, perhaps she lives alone, isn't used to talking to people very often, a bit slow and a bit hesitant, maybe. So it's that kind of change, shift in the voice. If it's a child, it depends on the kind. It depends on the kind of the character of the child.
Hello, I'm a bit shy. I sometimes see the murders in the crime books, and I have to be a witness. That happens sometimes.
So it's that kind of up and down and a different kind of uncertainty in the voice. But sometimes you have horrible kids that are kind of really rude, and so it's the acting that comes into it as well. So yeah, it does depend on the character. I've got a section which I would like to read, if that's okay, to demonstrate this skill. And this is one of my novellas, and it contains several characters with different voices talking to each other, which is really tiring when you're an audiobook narrator. And there's another book, I'm reading you another section of it, not the section I have in mind, which had something like 5 different, very strong accents in a conversation with all of these characters, and I needed a tea break after we did that scene. It was exhausting. So this scene that I'm about to read you, I'm hoping, if I'm doing my job correctly, you will get a feel for the different characters that are in this room. So to give this a bit of context, 3 mages have arrived at the house of a family in 1850s London because the brother of the main character has been reported as potentially having magical ability, and he's going to be tested by these mages. And they've arrived to do the testing, and they're all having tea together because, you know, this is 1850s Britain. You're not going to just test somebody for magic. You have a cup of tea first. So this is what happens. So, Magus Ledbetter said, after devouring 3 sandwiches and as many bites, "Did Master Judicant tell you what's what?" "Yes, sir," Father replied. "And it were you that reported this lad?" "Yes, sir." "So it's your neck on the block if he's not what you thought, then?" "Take no notice of him," said Major Ainsworth, throwing a glare in Ledbetter's direction.
Tell us why you made the report, Mr. Gunn. Your son's older than the average latent.
Her father told them the same as they'd told Master Judicant. Do you have any questions or any concerns that we can allay? Major Hopkins asked when the story was finished. His voice was so soothing. Will it be dangerous? Mother asked, and he shook his head. No, madam. I can assure you that your son will be perfectly safe throughout. We will each set him a test which employs a technique used within our specialisms. He'll be shown how to do it first, and we will be nearby when he attempts it himself. You won't be in the room with me?
We need to be certain that it's you,
Not us, said Major Ainsworth.
Master Judicant will be present for all of it, and he'll make the observations during your tests. We'll wait outside and be on hand if anything goes wrong, which it won't, but that's part of the rules.
Has anything ever gone wrong? Mother asked. Only the once since I started testing, said Major Ledbetter. It were the family's fault, though. Waited as long as they could before reporting the child. Then we had to test her when she was practically wild. Almost burnt the house down, bloody palaver that was. Charlotte tried to work out if he was telling them as some sort of comment about Ben's age. I'm far from wild, sir, Ben said, obviously thinking the same as her. Glad to hear it, Ledbetter said. We don't want you to hold back, mind you. The better you test, the more we pay. Simple as that. Will we have a chance to say goodbye before Ben leaves? Father asked. Of course, Ainsworth said. We're not jailers, Mr. Gunn. He's not being taken off to the gallows, is he now? But we do insist that the apprentice leaves within the hour, once the offer has been accepted. It's important to start right away, and it's best for family too. We test at home to give the latent the best chance of performing well. We've found that being in a familiar environment acts as a sort of a focus and helps with nerves too. But the sooner the apprentice learns the correct way to manage their talent, the better, especially in your case, young man. Late bloomer that you are. No, wrong with that, Ledbetter said, grasping for another round of sandwiches from the table beside him. Charlotte had wondered why he'd headed straight for that particular chair. I didn't manifest anything till I were 19 years of age, and then it were only a trifle. I were working too hard in pit to even notice. 24 years later, I'm one of the wealthiest men in Lancashire and one of the best dynamic practitioners you'll ever get to meet. The mills I run with my esoteric arts are the most efficient in the empire. There's an inverse correlation between his power and his modesty, Hopkins said. Scholars have written papers on it. Less of that, you, Ledbetter said through a mouthful of cucumber and crumbs. If I had a voice like yours, I'd keep my trap shut, lest anyone think the worst of me.
Oh, give over, the both of you, Ainsworth said. Ledbetter, you know as well as I do that whilst Hopkins might sound like a toff, there isn't a noble bone in his body. So there you go.
Thank you. That was fantastic.
Thank you. Major Ainsworth is based on my grandmother. She has exactly the same voice.
So I was listening to Planet Fall, the book that sort of featured as part of the book fair this year, and I really enjoyed the subtlety of accents that you brought to it, because very early on you've got 3 people speaking at the same time. One of them's American, one of them's female, one of them's male, and the subtlety that you brought to it was astonishing, because I could follow along and exactly who was speaking, and there was no he said, she said in one particular bit, and I thought that was really remarkable. Now, to be fair, I was listening out for it because I knew we were going to have this chat. But how has that changed your writing process? So you're incredibly prolific, which is brilliant, and it in such a sort of imaginative genre. So there's just a lot going on in terms of world building, in terms of plots, in terms of character development, in terms of magic, fantasy, dystopia, you run the gamut, and that's awesome. But has it changed? Has it changed anything?
Yes, it definitely has. So I think very carefully if I have any characters with accents, and I will only give them accents that I know how to do if I know that I'm going to be narrating that book, which is cheating, I know. But seriously, I have narrated books which have got characters with a very particular kind of voice or a particular kind of accent, and it brings nothing to the story. It just seems to be a way of differentiating that character from another character. And that has really irritated me as a narrator, because it's a lot of extra work, but there's nothing, it doesn't give the character any depth. And so whenever I'm making a decision about the voice that a character has, I want to know exactly why they have that kind of voice. So the character that you're referring to in the book, this is on an alien planet. This is somebody who has walked out of the wilderness on a planet where there are no other humans apart from this colony. And yet he arrives and he talks with a slight American accent. And that's because he was raised by a group of people who had an American in their group, and he picked up their accent. And so I give a great deal of thought as to what kind of places that person has lived in. And a lot of that is based on my own experience as well, because as a child, or in particular in my teenage years, I moved all over the country. And so my Cornish accent was just kind of rubbed off like with sandpaper. I had quite a broad Cornish accent. And then from moving around, you get teased. And so you hide it. And I became a mimic and mimicked the accents of the people around me. And when I went up to visit my family in the north, then it was almost embarrassing being from the south, because I didn't want to be a southern Jessie. Oh, you get on your big girl's blouse. It's not cold. It's like -2. That's warm. And I would be there shivering because I grew up in Cornwall. So I would hide anything that indicated where I came from. And so if I have a character with a neutral accent, it's like, why? Why do they not have a strong accent? So it does go into character creation a great deal, actually. I don't think I will ever write a character with any kind of size in the book that has a South African accent, because I find them so difficult. So difficult. It takes hours and hours and hours to practice like 3 lines in that accent. And I still don't have a good programmable phrase for that accent. That's why I struggle with it. So yeah, it does affect my writing. The other thing as well that I always do as part of my normal writing process is to read it aloud when it's the first draft. And it's almost like if you've made something out of wood and you run your hand over it to feel where the rough places are, you can do that with reading aloud in the prose, and especially in dialogue. Because sometimes when you're writing dialogue, it sounds fine in your head, but then when you actually say it out loud, you go, oh no, nobody talks like that. And I can tell the books that I narrate, which ones have been read aloud before published and which ones haven't. It's really obvious, because the speech patterns of the characters are unnatural, and the prose can be more clumsy. It's less smooth. So that's a really important part of the process as well.
Great.
So I've got other skills I can talk about if you like. There are more.
It's like juggling.
It is like juggling. So one of the things that you were talking about, how over that period of time that skills developed, the main one was stamina. The going into the to work.
How do you do
consistent?
that?
Yeah, it's really tiring. And when I get to the end of a day in the studio, I go back home and I'm like a cloth that has been wrung out. Oh. And I'm just rubbish. And I will say, hi, to my child. And he'll go, hi. And I'll go, and he'll go, okay, I'll leave you alone for a while. And I just can't communicate with people. It's like that bit of my brain has worn out. Because in the studio, you have to give all of your energy and all of your kind of speaking voice and the speaking part of your brain to the work. So it's not just stamina, it's concentration. And that's something that people, I think, don't appreciate when they haven't done recording in a studio setup. Because you can't just take a break after 10 minutes, or if you feel a bit tired or you're losing concentration, because there's a schedule to be followed, and the studio time costs money. And so you have to keep going and doing, an hour to an hour and 15 of really, really good, solid narration before you can have a very short break. And those breaks will be 10, 15 minutes long, and then I'll have a lunch break of half an hour to 3/4 of an hour. So the stamina and concentration together are very, very, very hard to deal with in the beginning. Another skill as well, of course, is enunciation. And there are so many words that we only come across from reading. And one of the important parts of the preparation of a book is to check the pronunciation of certain words.
Especially if there are certain as you said, if it's a character that you need to bring out their socioeconomic status.
Yeah.
So would you say scone or scone?
Yeah, and things like there was a comedy series in the UK called Only Fools and Horses.
Oh, yes.
And there's a character in that, Del Boy, who is like the most famous character. And they did a great bit of audio comedy which told you everything about the character, where he thought that speaking in French was sophisticated. And so he would pick up random French phrases and just say them, and say them wrong. So he would say it in the wrong context and with the wrong pronunciation. So there's one scene where he goes, mange tout, mange tout. Mange tout is a type of bean that you eat, and you pronounce it mange tout. And so for him to go mange tout, is really, it says everything that he is trying to be something he's not, and hasn't had education in that language. So mispronunciation can be just as important as the correct pronunciation. When it's in narrative, when it's not a character speaking, it obviously has to be completely correct. And so if you're ever wondering about the pronunciation of a phrase, a really good place to go is the Cambridge Dictionary website. They have a button where you can listen to the word pronounced in a US accent and in a UK accent. And sometimes there are real differences, and that's so important when you're acting as an American character who might say anti instead of anti-matter, that kind of thing. That's really important.
And I'm guessing Australian something in between.
Yeah, that's another accent I find really, really hard. So yeah, there are those accent differences in pronunciation. And finally, another skill obviously is acting. You have to convince people that you are those characters, but also that you are those characters usually in very stressful times of their lives. Books have conflict because they'd be boring without them. We don't meet these characters when they're sitting at home reading a book, drinking a cup of tea. We meet them in crisis. And so you have to be able to convey distress and convey stress or distress to sound like you're crying. I made my producer cry on a book where one of the characters is bereaved, and he's talking about the woman he loved. And she started to cry, and I was like, do I
Keep going?
Do I start? And I thought I better keep going, and it was a really weird experience. And then lastly, something that people don't think about is the sight reading. If you can't read ahead and read quickly, you're not going to produce clean audio. You may still be able to narrate, but you'll have far more errors because you won't know until you've got to that place in the sentence how it's supposed to be spoken. And also, you can't memorize an entire book before you go into the studio. You often only get a chance to read it once, unless it's an accent, and then you've read those millions of times. But the narrative of the book, you've read once, but you have to make it sound like it's the most natural delivery in the world. And it's sight reading that gives you that skill rather than practice.
That's what you were saying earlier, wasn't it, of splitting your brain in two almost,
Yeah.
and it's very active work. It sounds like. But I would also argue from a listener's perspective, it is an excellent exercise in mindfulness, because you can read a book passively, you can skim a book passively, you can have the radio in the background as you're doing the washing up or you're driving. But if you miss 30 seconds of a book you're listening to, you're going to have to go back, or else it just doesn't make any sense.
I'm rubbish at listening to audiobooks.
Are you?
Yeah, and people say, oh, you must listen to so many audiobooks. And I'm like, no, because I'm terrible at concentrate. I think part of it is because it's also my job. So I will get distracted because I listen to a way that a line has been delivered, or I listen to their accent or their voice acting,
And then you're thinking about, how do I apply
that's
it?
good. Yeah, what could I learn from that? And then you've missed several sentences, and so I find it very, very hard to concentrate on audiobooks.
I think it's also because we're just perennially distracted now, aren't we?
Yeah, that's true.
How many of us have unfortunately, I never have this with me, and I forgot to put it away, so it's been buzzing all this time. So I don't know if you guys have seen me sort of try to move it around so you don't hear the buzzing. But as I'm watching something, I'm like, well, what does my email say from 30 seconds ago? So I actually think this could be such a handy tool in getting us all to just calm down and focus on a great story.
And it's a great thing to do whilst just sewing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there are some things you can do at the same time, and that does help me to listen, is if I'm occupying my hands, that kind of restlessness.
For me, it's chopping things up.
Yeah.
Because otherwise that time's dead to me.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. That'd be interesting in some crime novels, chopping vegetables at certain... I think I would have to stop. It gets quite gruesome. Some of the things I've read have been really gruesome. And there was one book which I said if I'd known what was going to happen in terms of the crime, I'm not sure I would have taken on the project, because it was so upsetting and so distressing, those scenes.
Oh, no.
And it's a kind of an interesting ethical dilemma sometimes for the studio. And the studio has actually turned down a couple of books because they felt that they were just too awful to make a narrator read. Because they were so distressing.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting kind of line between providing a service to the publisher and caring for your narrators. Because they were books that they turned down. So
Do you ever have the opposite problem where you're reading something and it's so funny you laugh?
I've never. Okay, right. So there is a story about laughing at the wrong time, and. So I've done some romance books, as I've mentioned, and
oh no, I can see where this is going.
Yeah. So there were two books. One was a historical romance which had a sex scene, and when I saw this book come up, it was most of a chapter. It was like 6,000 words of sex, and it was like day 3 of this book, and I was dreading it because the sound engineer was a man and my director was a man. And I felt really embarrassed about reading this scene. And it was back when we used to do punch-in recordings. So if I made a mistake, we'd have to stop, go back, start again. And I did not want to go over any of those lines more than once, believe me. And so I said, let's have a cup of tea before this one. So we had a tea break.
I love that that's your solution to absolutely everything.
It is the solution to everything, actually.
I mean, I personally believe that on a deep philosophical level as well.
This is a very important thing. So we had a cup of tea, and I was like, okay, I'm going to do it. And I narrated, I think it was 6,300 and something words perfectly, with not one single error, because I did not want to do the sex bits twice with the men in the studio. So we got to the end of the chapter, and there was this, I could hear the click of the sound engineer switching it off, and he was like, bloody hell. I was like, can I have another cup of tea? I'm really tired. So we had a second tea break after only one chapter. So that was one book. Another book I got started, the beginning of the book is somebody having an orgasm. And when I picked up this manuscript to read it, and it like has ooh and ah, and I was like, no, oh my God, no. So I dreaded starting this book.
Did you have to do the onomatopoeia?
I had to accurately portray a woman having a very powerful orgasm as part of my job. What? It was very odd. So I went to work that morning absolutely dreading it because, again, it was Dave who was the sound engineer and Aaron who was the director. And I walked in and we all just looked at each other and we all knew what we were thinking. And so Aaron said, do you want a cup of tea first? And I was like, no, we're going to get this over and done with. And they were like, it never starts without a cup of tea. But I was so nervous. I thought, I'm just going to get it. I'm going to go in there. I'm going to get it over and done with. We'll do chapter 1 and then we'll have a tea break and talk about the rest of the book. So I went into the booth, got set up, got the book ready, and Dave was like, okay, ready when you are. And then when we were rolling, I acted this orgasm very, very well, in my humble opinion. And then at the end of it, there was this click, and I was like, oh no, what? There are no words. What could I have got wrong in this paragraph of grunting and oohs and ahs? There is no mistake that I could have made. And Dave's voice came through and said, I'm really sorry, Em, but you overloaded the mic. You were too loud. We've got to do it again, but can you lean back? And that was a really good lesson I learned that day, that you lean back from the mic when you're going to do something really loud, because I just blasted the sound levels, and so we had to record the orgasm again, but leaning back. And then we had a cup of tea, and we laughed about it, and we still laugh about it to this day. And that was a really terrible book. It was, yeah.
I'm not going to be as cruel as to ask you to demonstrate.
No, I would not do that ever again, hopefully.
Not even for a cup of tea?
Not even for a cup of tea. Maybe for a lot of money, but then that gets really dodgy.
Yes,
so
it
no,
does.
No, I'm not going to do that again.
So on that note, shall we open the floor for questions?
Yeah, I've no idea how much time we have left. I have another couple of examples if people want them, of different skills, or we can take questions.
We've got around 10 minutes left.
Oh, blimey. I talk too much.
No. Well, that was the point of this,
Yes.
telling us a story. So should we open up the floor for questions? We've got some microphones floating around, so just please put your hand up if you're... We've got one over here.
I think I can just be loud enough.
Okay.
With your narration now, do you get offered roles to do movie scenes where, to voice over an existing actor's voice?
Oh, no, I haven't had anything like that. The studio does do some work with actors where if they record a scene outside and the dialogue isn't clear enough, they will come and do it, where they watch the screen and then they do their own lines again, which I didn't know happened until the studio told me that. I've been approached to do voice work for computer games as a result of the narration. Only little tiny independent computer games, but it's mostly audiobooks. And I'm at the stage now where people will ask for me to do books, which is really, really nice. I went to a convention where I read from my own book, and there was an author in the audience who heard it and went, oh, she has to read my books. And then she got a book deal with an audio book attached to it, and asked me if I would narrate them. And I had already worked with the audiobook company that was recording it, so it was dead easy. She just said, can she do it? And they said, yes. And that was it. There was no audition or anything. So that's the kind of work that I get rather than any kind of voiceover work. I've done a couple of adverts, which I hated. It was awful. You have to be really artificially bright. They were radio adverts, and it was so fake, and I felt so ridiculous being excited about, I can't even remember, I think one was a car wash, and another one was a swimming pool magazine or something, I don't even remember. And Aaron kept saying, bit more bright, smile more. And I was like, it's a car wash. And he's like, this is just how you do it, Em. It's just how you do it. So I didn't enjoy doing the adverts. Yeah, my acting can only go so far, and being excited about car washes is not there, no.
Any more questions? Yeah, please.
A slightly technical question about reading ahead. Have you settled into a particular distance for reading ahead, like 5 words ahead or 10 words ahead, or do you find it constantly and dynamically changing all the time, switching from 5 to 10 to 15. And what exactly is reading ahead? Does it really mean that your eyeballing is 10 words ahead of your mouth? Or does it really mean that your eyes are actually going to and fro between your mouth and your target point? Sorry for being rather meticulous.
They're good questions. So in terms of the number of words ahead, it depends on what is being read. So, for example, in dialogue, and where there's quick exchanges of dialogue, I may just hop to the next line to see which character is saying those words. So that's a very short jump ahead. If it's a large passage of narrative prose, I may go a little bit further ahead because I need to be able to create the right kind of energy and pacing for that scene. But I would say that it's never more than 1 or 2 sentences ahead. Because if you think about the limits of working memory, you can only hold a small amount of actual data in your mind, and some of that is what I'm actually speaking at the time. So it is only a short distance ahead. Sometimes as well, it's a dart ahead with the eyes. So I will, if it's in dialogue in particular, I will look for names. Or even if it's just he said or she said, some kind of indicator of who I should be being in my voice. When it comes to kind of the pacing and things like that, I think it's more back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Because as you're speaking, you're moving forwards through the sentence, and so you have to keep looking ahead. Where it's a longer kind of narrative sentence, you go back again to make sure that you're saying the right words. If it's a short line of dialogue, you know what they're going to say. Like, don't do that. That's very quick. You don't have to look back. So it does depend on the actual content that you're reading in that moment. And that's why it's so tiring as well, because you're processing a lot of information at the same time, that going out and coming in at the same time. So yeah, the sight reading, I mean, the sight reading is involved in the concentration, and that affects your stamina. So they're all interlinked. But I think it's the sight reading that's one of the most critical skills. And certainly I've had discussions with my director that when they work with new narrators, the ones who are good sight readers will always be better right away than the ones who are not good sight readers. And you can improve your sight reading. All of these things improve with practice, but some people just don't improve that skill, and they will never be able to be a regular narrator for a studio, because it adds a day or 2 days to the recording time, which makes it very expensive. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Great question, by the way.
Yeah.
Really loved how you phrased that. Over there, one there and there.
I know that you rehearse before the real recording, but as we know that when we read aloud, those moments pop up when we really want to appreciate the texture of the sentences by ourselves. I'd love to ask a question like, how do you balance this desire to finish your job and the personal appreciations of the sentence? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I find I read very differently when I'm preparing a manuscript. So I tend to read very quickly, and I read in a different way. So when I'm reading for my pleasure, if it's a really good book and there's a really beautiful sentence, I will stop and go, ooh, and there's a magical moment of enjoying that language. When I'm preparing an audiobook, it's like a different part of my brain is working with the words. So I'm looking for technical details. I'm looking for words that I'm not 100% sure of the pronunciation for. I'm looking for what the energy is in that particular scene rather than the personal enjoyment of the language. That actually comes in the studio when I'm narrating the book. And that's when I feel like I really go inside a book. It is like stepping inside a book. and I will develop a really deep appreciation of the characters and the plot line and the construction of the novel and the narrative structure when I'm reading literally every single word as perfectly as I can. So it's a very different experience to reading for pleasure.
Hi. You mentioned that you first started out in narration, narrating your own unpublished novel. And just out of curiosity, where were you posting your chapters?
Just on my blog, because it was on the days when blogs were still important. That's how long ago it was. And I think that I was just starting on Facebook, and I had just started on Twitter. But it was the age when you had a blog and then you went to somebody else's blog and you read and then you left a comment and people would find your blog from your comment and come back to, and I look back at it and go, wow, it was a different time. Whereas nowadays, you would put something somewhere like on SoundCloud or whatever and then link to it from social media. It was very different back then. So yeah, it was the community of people that read my blog regularly. Fancy that. It's very, very long time ago.
I think we've got one more question over here. It's coming.
Thank both of you, and Emma, I find you very attractive. And
Thank you.
I'm also a dubbing actor, but because of my sore throat, my voice is not beautiful today. And I want to ask, what do you think the difference between to being a narrator and do the regular dubbing work, especially when you record the male characters line? I think when you do the male characters line, I think it's weird. I can be loaded on audio. I can be dramatic, but I don't think I can do that. I still think I can imagine the picture.
Yeah, this is something I worried about a lot when I started narration. That I can act emotion, and I can change voices and make it clear when somebody is a female voice and a male voice by. That's why it's very important how I have a chapter breakdown, because I need to see if there's more than one male character and more than one female character, because I need to be able to act their voices with what we refer to mostly as differentiation. In audiobook work, what is the most important thing is that the reader knows that they are different characters that are speaking. People accept that if it's a female voice narrator, a female voice that's narrating the book, that we can't necessarily make our voices as deep as a male voice. But if we make them deeper, if we differentiate, that's just accepted as close as you can get. And it's the same for male narrators who are reading female characters. And you have to be really careful not to sound like a Monty Python character. The Monty Python sketches where they act as old women and they just sound, really funny voices. So it's as much that it's just a slight lift in the voice. It could be as simple as just speaking just a little bit higher as opposed to a little bit deeper. And that's that differentiation between the two that makes it obvious who is speaking and just that there are two different characters in the room. Do you see just it's that difference which is more important than necessarily sounding like a man. Because it's impossible for most people. There are some voice actors who do incredible work, but they tend to work in animation and do The Simpsons. They're not necessarily audiobook narrators. That's what my director told me. And he said, that is the most important thing. It's your job as the narrator to make sure that the listener never gets lost or confused. And it's not just with the characters as well. When you have a really half a page of narrative with no dialogue, how you deliver that has a big impact on how well that is understood by the listener. Because that, again, is your main job, is to make sure that people are processing that information as easily as possible so that they can just enjoy the story. I hope that helps.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much. Emma, that was fascinating. I think we've all learned a lot. Thank you so much for sharing with us today.
Thank you.
And yeah, I think.
Thank you for coming.